Thanks for listening to the Replatform podcast, sponsored by Attract and Hypersonics and hosted by me, James Gerd, and Paul Rogers. Well, warm welcome if it's your first time. I hope you enjoy it. We put a lot of time and effort into bringing you amazing guests and bringing all this content for free. Help us keep it that way, please. Refer us to other people in your network. Let people know that podcasts exist. Share our posts on LinkedIn and Twitter. Anything you do to amplify our reach would be greatly appreciated. Give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. If you haven't already, it helps boost our visibility. So with that all said, let's crack on with the episode. Today we're talking about ERP implementations for e-commerce businesses. So practical insights and advice from somebody who's been there, done it, worn the t-shirt several times. So let's start our introduction to Nick from Ogre. So Nick, do you want to give people a bit of a background on who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am Nick. So my background is really service and support infrastructure. I started way back in the year 2000 doing, about pre the year 2000, and I found myself in retail over the last 15 years. Worked in ERP, predominantly ERP and Omni solutions for the last 10 years or so, and more recently been working with e-com platforms and integrations. I'm currently the CTO at Owen and responsible for all technology, including the e-commerce development roadmap.
Right. So you and I have loosely worked together at quite a few companies now. We've obviously spoke a lot over the last few years around kind of back office, ERPs, kind of different levels of processes, etc. Can you just talk us through some of the ERP projects specifically that you've been a part of?
Sure. So the first one was a long while ago. First big project was deployment of Ireland Pacific. Back in 2010, I think it was, which was, it was a huge project, a lot of stores, a lot of concessions, a lot of stock, and really complicated. And that's, although to be brutally honest, I think that's where I learned more about how not to do projects than I did how to learn how to do projects, particularly with ERP. It was an enormous investment by the business, like huge. There were lots of misses and requirements. And go live and ensuing 3 to 6 months were incredibly painful, predominantly around stock accuracy, knowing where the stock was, etc. So yeah, it was a really challenging one. I guess more recently, I've been working on less big implementations, more about driving value out of systems. So taking requirements, trying to bend the systems to sometimes meet quite challenging business needs. One of my favorites so far was actually an affiliate solution. So a hybrid between franchise and owned stores. The challenge was how to manage the same inventory, so same items in a single system, but different locations, while preventing sort of an impact to cost of goods. So you're not, impacting your margin, but also not allowing or not giving any opportunity for the auditors to cause any problems. I've also worked on quite a few projects involving integration, more recently tax compliance, which was a lot of fun, and automations. The thing you love about ERP is the complexity. It might seem odd, but there's so many different ways to achieve what you want, and half the fun is taking the requirement and working out what the best solution is.
Yep, absolutely. And I guess when a brand or business kind of starts looking at back office, or maybe like going from a few different systems that are playing different parts to an ERP, or just generally kind of upgrading their stack, what should they be looking at and where should they start, I guess? Or like, what's your view on that kind of main starting point?
Requirements, always with the requirements. And the requirements are not just kind of throwing things on a bit of paper, and it's not just the Moscow ratings. It's not just about that, but it should be driven by the business. I definitely recommend trying to find subject matter experts. But I also think that it shouldn't just be about them. It should also be about technology and trying to get some influence from, I guess, external experts as well as internal experts. Objectivity, I think, is really important. Particularly when you're dealing with external help, external expert help. I think it's really good to be challenged. So having those challenges back to some of those requirements, stopping the list getting out of control, I think is quite important. I think also engagement, get the right people engaged at the right time. It's got to be a top-down project. If you're kind of CEO, your senior stakeholders, your business leaders aren't involved or aren't engaged in it, it's going to struggle. And that's from experience. Really, investors all the way down, I'd suggest. I mean, it's not just about the people within the business, and it's all the way down to the shop floor. Again, as I kind of mentioned, ERP is often said to be tech or an IT project. It definitely is, but it's also a business project. It's predominantly a business project. Tech and IT can't deliver a successful project without the business involvement. The business have to be there and have to be on board. The other thing I think you got to bear in mind when starting it is that ERP is enormously complex and time consuming. It needs focus, and inevitably people will need support in their day-to-day job. It's very difficult to run both. And timing would be the last, well, I say last thing, or one of the last things is to work out the best timing for a project around trading and try and hit that. Don't be worried about delaying it if you really have to, but don't try and squeeze it in.
Makes sense. And just a sub question. So one of the things you talked about there was stakeholders and it being at least mostly a business project. And you mentioned some people that need to be involved. Like from your perspective, which stakeholders are key to kind of mapping out those requirements?
So the thing we use a lot in, I say we, but in ERP projects in general is SMEs, subject matter experts. So at least one or two people for every department that really know their job, right? They know the business, they know the challenges, they know the issues, they know what works as well, right? They are the ones that need to be defining your processes. It can be challenging if those people have been in the business a long time and might be a little stuck in their ways. I wouldn't necessarily advocate that they are the best people. It needs to be people who are willing to kind of take themselves out, be really objective and look at the process and say, well, actually, what can we make a bit better? What am I willing to sacrifice for the sake of simplicity?
And it's, I totally agree about the start with requirements, because looking at technology when you don't know why is one of the worst things you can do in the world, because you end up down the rabbit hole. What I'd love to hear is, because you've gone through this process, different businesses, and there are lots of different ways to capture requirements, and there are potentially hundreds of them that will end up in a final project from an assessment point of view, but not all fundamentally influence the selection of the technology. Some of them just relate to implementation. What's your advice on what are the capabilities that fundamentally influence vendor selection in this space?
Oh, that is a really challenging question.
On a Friday afternoon.
Well, I don't think it's a simple answer. I think everybody's different. Everyone will have their own requirements. I've more recently moved into furniture from fashion, and it's a very different business, right? Very, very different. Order book management, lead times, all that kind of stuff adds an additional amount of complexity. Bill of materials, again, huge amounts of complexity within an ERP system. So I think it's too simple to say there are specific things. I do rate Moscow as an initial rating process. So getting those high level requirements down, so a title and a description and a Moscow rating. So must, could, should, or would, right? And again, question within the project team, question those Moscow ratings. Say, well, actually, is it really required, or is it maybe a should, could, or would? So that is probably where I'd start. Of course, every business unit expert will have lots of musts. It's working out a little bit about, what the reality is of these things. What can they really, potentially live without? I also think the landscape at the moment of ERP is a really interesting one. There is a fairly sizable gap between what I'd call the more reasonably priced options to the enterprise options. And this can be to the tune of £1 million in terms of deployment, £1 million in 12 months worth of work. So actually, I think choices at the moment are fairly limited with where you go.
Attract, your complete product discovery growth engine. Create relevant shopping experiences that convert into sales and grow online revenue with personalized search, merchandising and recommendation solutions powered by AI. Find out more at attract.com.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I agree that as an industry standpoint, Moscow is quite good at an early stage. I guess the project lead has to have the discipline with the subject matter experts to coax them into applying a sensible lens to that, so not everything is a bust, which can be fun politically. But one of the points you raised earlier about resourcing, and often businesses need to use like specialist consultants or external advice in this to get the right outputs. It is such a specialist area. I'd love to know, because one of the things I've seen in some projects is the budgetary discussion, which is, okay, we need advice, but do you know what? We're not sure we can really afford to do it. How do you get value from this resource? Because you've got to make sure that you get an ROI on spending a decent sum of money on an external specialist.
I agree. I think, and I know cost is really important. And particularly at this current moment in time, I think everybody's keen on cost. I think with any large transformation project, put as much as you possibly can in, right? Because this will stand you for, in fact, longer than 5 or 10 years now. The older, on-prem monolithic systems were fairly short-lived with upgrades and so on. Nowadays, it's SaaS. It will be with you for 10 plus years, right? These are long-term systems you're putting in for the long term. So don't scrimp on it. Do try and find whatever you can to do it. Take some advice from others who have done this. One of the last project I did right in the beginning, I actually spoke to some recruiters, and this is quite someone recommended I do this, and I thought it was really clever. Go and speak to some recruiters, and recruiters will put you in touch with consultants who can love to have a conversation about the projects they've done and give you advice as to whether you should do that project with that software or not. They can give you really great insights about things that have worked and haven't worked. The reason they do this is twofold. Number one, because if they give you good information, you're likely to use them in the future if you ever decide to choose that software. On the flip side, if they give you if you're frightened off by the things that they say, you're not going to have a failed project. So it's within their interest to do this type of thing. And I had some of the most useful information on the very last project I was on was delivered by those guys. So I thought that was really fascinating. On the kind of the real involvement in the project, I don't think it needs an enormous amount of time. I don't think that person has to be in the room for every project meeting, for every status update, all that type of thing. I think you can pick and choose when you need them. I think if you start someone with you in the beginning, they can follow the project and advise, a bit like a non-exec, right? It's an advisory thing. They're there to help you process and progress. And even if it's just as a mediator at times, I think it can be really useful.
That makes sense. And I think, I definitely agree with that in terms of the role of the consultant. Next question. So I think James and I obviously spend a lot of time evaluating e-com platforms, and, it's getting increasingly hard to compare because of all the different variables. But I think one thing that I always look at is like ecosystem, kind of documentation, APIs, like proven relevant case, all of that kind of stuff. Is this the same when it comes to ERPs? Like, what else would you look at when you're trying to compare ERP solutions?
Oh, that's a good one. I think you learn a lot from speaking to other businesses that use the platforms you're looking at. I think use references and speak to, as I mentioned a second ago, speak to contractors. So I thought that was, like I say, the process I went through previously. I learned so much from that, looking at various different verticals, various different businesses, and the feedback I got was invaluable. I think I wouldn't necessarily go to documentation, wouldn't necessarily go to APIs, that type of thing. I think it's really all about, as so often is, about the relationship you're able to have and the honesty you're able to get out of the third parties you will inevitably use to deploy the platforms. I think that during demos, you really need to push kind of the real world scenarios where I can see, processing the back payment. This is what it looks like here, but what if we wanted to do that? I can see creating this order. I can see it looks like this, but if I added this and I did that, and if I wanted to do whatever it might be, try and run it through in your own mind about how it would look for you. If you can get the third party to also kind of make it specific for your company, then I think that is also incredibly useful, because you just follow the flow in your head, follow the flow on the screen, make it real to you. I think that's enormously important. If you do that, and again, if you've got those subject matter experts in the room, you'll start to pick out the things that don't necessarily work so well. Be wary of consultants. Oh, don't worry about that. Just do this because of this. Well, don't let them get away with it. Let them go away and let them come back and do another demo. We'd like to see that again, please. We'd like you to prove that it does actually do what we says it does. You say it does, because often that will simply be, you'll forget about it next week. A day in the life is really good as well. A day in the life of a particular person within a team. So if you're able to do those day in the life, it might be a document map. It might just be once a month I upload inventory adjustments into an ERP. Well, how would you do that? How would that work for you? How does that look? If I had an error on an import, how would I see that error? This is a really important one for tech, right? And and actually, if you look at smaller brands who might not have a tech team, might not have a really competent IT team or background, talking about those things. Well, what happens if an order doesn't flow in? What happens if an item doesn't ship out? What do I do? How do I see that is happening? I think that is hugely important. What happens if a payment doesn't go through? All those little bits and pieces. So think about those things that are likely to cause a problem, and then get them to show you how it works. So less about documentation, less about APIs, more about really getting your head into how the system works and how it might work for you.
Okay, so
the one other thing actually that I think is probably worthwhile, looking at the vendor's roadmap, right, and what they've invested in over time. I think that's a really, really key piece, right? Because you're buying a platform that is for the long term, for the long run. You want to make sure that people are still, that the company is backing it and still investing into it.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. And I think that's also relevant to platforms as well. There's a number of platforms that have been acquired in the last few years that have become a bit less progressive, and definitely invest more time on the product.
I agree on that, and I think we could all name them, right? I think we could all name those platforms.
But it's also, I think, the scrutiny that level deeper, where it's not just what's in the roadmap, it's what's committed with release date versus what have you talked about, and also how much of the customer feedback gets translated into features. Products like Gorgeous are really good at like crowdsourcing feedback and then displaying visibly about where things are at. And I think that's, bang on point is, you want to know that there's going to be some activity if there's something that becomes important to you and to other merchants. Definitely.
I mean, again, we're all retailers, right? So many retailers are very similar in what they do. If you know that the provider is engaged in that sector, then they're likely to be committing time and effort to it.
I think one other sub question is, so like you said, I think some of those kind of more detailed bits of scrutiny made perfect sense. Do you think, is it a case of often you would select the platform or the ERP, and then some of that would go into the people that are actually implementing it for you, or like the SI? Do you think, would you say that's, is it kind of a split, or would you say you need to kind of address a lot of that at vendor level?
I think the SIs generally, and I think this is almost all platforms, the SIs are almost better than the vendor at deploying. The ERPs that I am aware of and I've worked with over time, I have felt like the vendors have been really pretty useless, right? They don't know their product very well. Their user or their staff or their kind of tech base is quite fluid. I'm not sure they necessarily keep training up to date. And I also don't think they've had the experience, right? The SIs have so much more experience, and therefore are able to answer your questions better. So I think you could start with a vendor, but there's very few that I would recommend actually going with.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting, like that whole piece. I think James and I have probably covered it quite a lot with the platform. as well. There's a lot of e-com platforms that they've got really good sales and pre-sales teams, but they're not, like you said, they haven't done implementations themselves, so they don't have the experience, and maybe they're not best placed to answer some of those detailed questions. So next question. So I think this is a really common topic of discussion at the moment, partly because of some of the high growth brands that have kind of grown up through the pandemic, or kind of, grown as a result of like hugely increased demand over a short period of time. But when is the right time to introduce an ERP? And obviously, it's pretty subjective, very broad. But in terms of like, do you think there's a stage of growth or a level of revenue or any other variables that kind of make it the right time to look at ERP? And then a kind of sub question as well alongside it is, what's your view on whether it's always right to go down the ERP route versus, a series of best-in-class back-office solutions like an OMS and, kind of IMS and everything else?
I don't think there's a right answer, but I think there are lots of wrong answers. It's entirely dependent, in my view, on... It's not entirely dependent. There are so many variables involved, right? If you start too early, you might not know what you're looking for. If you start too late, it might just be too much for you to handle. So I think that, I think it is really subjective. I think it's got to come down to requirements. It's got to be about what you're trying to achieve. If you can't achieve what you want in the system that you have, and you really can't achieve it, right? I'm a big fan of eking everything you can out of platforms. There's no point just changing because, we can't do this little thing. Let's just throw everything out. That's not, I wouldn't advocate for that at all. Last as long as you reasonably can, and then look to change for all the relevant benefits you're looking for. I think finance actually comes into this quite a lot. Finance can often be the decision maker here. If you're talking about cross-border, if you're talking about more complex, financial calculations, being able to report more effectively on your inventory or your sales or whatever, I think that can be a really big part of migrating cross-border. All that kind of stuff, I think, is a really big thing. So I think finance can often be the decision maker. I mean, ultimately, they hold the purse strings as well. So to have them on board is pretty important. But it's really about what you're trying to achieve, I think. I'd also advocate, I think, that there are certain systems, again, depending on your company's route of travel, what the company is looking to achieve in the near future, 3 to 5 years, whatever, what things are likely to come out of the woodwork that you're going to need to want to do. Changing ERPs is not the easiest. It's the thing that tends to slow people down. So if you know that you're on a trajectory, if you know your plans are to grow into additional markets, different currencies, etc., then that's probably the time to start thinking about it. Different pools of stock, that type of thing. That's the time where you should probably start thinking about it. Take something that will grow with you. That's probably the key. I'm looking for something that is feature rich, but I don't have to do all of it. To your point about kind of the composable piece, it's a big thing. It's a bit like multi-channel becoming omni-channel, growing all the rest. I think that having best of breed is fine, but you need to be prepared for it. It can get enormously complicated. Right? I don't think there is I think without a competent technology team, I think generally people will struggle, because putting systems together is inordinately complicated.
I've definitely seen that a bit recently, actually. I think, but the interesting thing is where I've seen it the most is when there's one problem that needs to be solved, which in the few cases I've been exposed to is inventory, and then they've gradually introduced additional systems, so like an OMS, for example, to handle like order routing and stuff like that. But I think you're right, because you end up with a lot of information in different people's heads, and it is
getting that data between systems can be super complicated, right? I take this I always use this as an example, but point of sale, you walk into a shop and you buy something, or you give something back, or whatever. It doesn't seem particularly complicated. If you're using a POS system and an ERP system, if you're trying to take transactions from a point of sale and put them in ERP, it is phenomenally complicated, because the various different permutations of that transaction or transactions in point of sale are huge. It's not like e-com where you have a transaction, it goes into ERP or MS and it goes out. There's exchanges, refund, split payment, refund to gift card, pay for gift card. It's huge, right? It's really, really significant. If you get it wrong, then you will be forever chasing your tail.
Hypersonics helps e-commerce companies make more profit every day. This AI-driven platform delivers recommendations for pricing and inventory that lead to bigger profits. Visit hypersonics.ai/podcast to get a free trial.
Yeah, that's why it's an interesting point you made about often being a finance-driven thing, because in a lot of the projects I've seen, it is a finance-driven area where the data tie-up is not right, where the reconciliation reporting isn't good enough, and often it's ERP to handle that, because it does the stock piece, it does the data piece, and it does the leading ones do the BI piece. So finance team can get exactly what they want in one place. Whereas a lot of businesses I've seen that aren't complex in terms of their stock handling, where they don't have loads of stores and therefore it's not so complicated, would often just have e-commerce with a bit of order management pushing into WMS to send orders down and get updates. So yeah, interesting. I got a question about if somebody, because there'll be people listening who've gone through this and again, some new insights for future projects, those who've not done an ERP project. What's your view on phasing versus, how sensible is it for people to phase versus how feasible is it to actually trying to roll in different releases versus just actually trying to do everything at once? Because there are distinct pros and cons to each approach.
I think it's dependent on your appetite for risk. I think also there's an amount of expertise within the business about how much expertise you have and you're willing to commit to it. There are also lots of complexities of not doing a big release, of not doing a big bang, is that if you're only doing a small part of the system, you have to integrate your legacy systems to the new one. And that adds an additional amount of complexity. It involves more effort to make sure that those things are working and working correctly, so that when you do finally turn those off and move over, that it's all working well. Yeah, I think it's an appetite for risk. I think that's really the key thing. It's got to be right for you. Trading, I guess the trading calendar is a large part of that as well. I think that if there are specific things that are going on with your business, you might find it easier to do particular areas first. If it's a finance project, get finance done first. Maybe that's the simplest answer, and then start pulling more and more bits in over time. But yeah, definitely the appetite for risk thing. The other thing to bear in mind also, I think if it is a big, delivered over time, a phased process, I think that cost will be higher. I think that's inevitable, because if you're trying to put systems together, cobble them together, that's going to add a decent amount of money to your overall project.
Kind of leads me on nicely to my next question, which is having worked in e-commerce for many years and seen e-commerce run in parallel with ERP projects, it's rare for an ERP project to land on time because of the moving parts and the different dependencies on systems, other people. So there's risk. And you've just talked about your risk appetite. So could you just give people a bit of summary? What are the biggest mistakes you see or you've experienced getting made? And then what are the steps to de-risk? What can you do to be more sensible about how you approach this?
So I think external help can be really useful, right? I think that having a voice that is not seen to be or seen to be independent, I think is really important, because it will get engagement. They need to be fairly senior. They can't just be someone who hasn't got the gravitas to do it. So I think that is really key. I think lack of involvement at a senior level is one of the biggest challenges. assuming the way that you do things now, or the way that a particular department or subject matter expert does things now is the best way to do it, because inevitably it may not be. Not being open to change kind of goes together with the last one I mentioned. Be willing to be objective about the way that you do things. Have a think and try and step out of your current day to day and look at it slightly differently. Not getting requirements right. I mean, a fairly obvious one, but not really thinking through that requirement, or saying that something is super important, which, supersedes or knocks something else down the rung. That can be really bad news. And the final one is picking the wrong partner. This one is a really big one for me. I think that contract, statement of works, requirements are all well and good, but everything changes. An ERP project is not a week, 2 weeks, 3 months. It's often 6 to 12 months, and relationships can get strained. People will move, people will get tired, fed up. If you don't have the relationship with the partner, and the partner doesn't have the skill set, you're in serious trouble. You're in serious trouble. Be honest with yourself as well about the mistakes you might be making. Put your hands up. If you make a mistake, you've got to put your hands up, right? The only way you will ever resolve these issues is by putting your hands up. Do you know what? I got that requirement wrong, or I asked for the wrong thing, or whatever it might be. Be honest about it. If you're not honest about it, it's very rarely that you'll find a fix for it. If you're open and honest and say you've messed something up, it'll generally get fixed because people will appreciate it. Yeah. And like I say, that person who's independent, I think is a really key thing.
Right. And final question. So obviously you've already given lots of advice around this area, but do you have any kind of final parting bits of advice for businesses that are approaching an ERP migration or a selection project?
Go slow. There's someone that I've been talking to for quite a long time. I don't think they've even started yet. I think it's been going on for almost a year. And I actually really respect that. I respect the time and the effort that they're going through to really think about it. So go slow, get external help. As I mentioned, I think it's really positive. Expect delays. Like you said, James, already, it's going to be delayed. It's inevitable. So build in some time, and backfill your subject matter experts. Support them and backfill them, because if you don't, they will burn out, or the likelihood is that they will burn out, or they'll miss something, etc. So look after your team. That's really critical.
I think that's a great final point, because often you see in projects there's loads of engagement up front and a flurry of onboarding. Isn't this exciting? And we really value. And then because these projects are long and they're complex, and you have setbacks, and you get moments where people go, and then people go. It's maintaining that enthusiasm and motivation so that people don't get downhearted and don't go, sod it, I've lost interest in the project. Any specific tips on that? What have you seen in projects where that's been managed well, and what are the techniques to keep people really motivated through the project?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I've ever done it incredibly well. I think simple things, coffees and biscuits. Right, I know that might seem ridiculous, but coffees and biscuits in meetings, days of ERP meetings can be tiring, right? And mentally and emotionally, sometimes it can really drain you. So just having a break, doing some coffee, getting people coffees, getting biscuits, I think that is a really positive thing. People do respond to that, keeping the sugar levels up. Beyond that, I think making sure that, coming back to that senior team thing, having the senior team or managers check in with those subject matter. How's it going? How are you getting on? How you feel it's going? What things do you think could different? Get them to be asking those questions, because if they're getting that recognition, that is also a really critical thing. Final thing I'd say is, I really do believe that it's a career builder doing projects like this, whether it be ERP, whether it be e-commerce, whatever big change it is. It really is a career builder. You can really change your trajectory if you involve yourself in these kind of projects. So it shouldn't just be, oh God, I've got to do this as well as some of my day job, blah, blah, blah. This is really good for you, right? This is a really good thing to be involved in, not just in the business you might be in now, but in future businesses as well.
Yeah, that's a really nice. I can attest that because having done a couple of replatform projects when I was head of e-commerce, I've now like shamelessly built a consultancy partly out of doing those things. So yeah, definitely. Yeah, it can be. I like the idea about the sugar thing. I totally agree with you. Sometimes just open up like a packet of Krispy Kremes to people. Just the little things that show that you care can help. Nick, really enjoyed this episode. Thanks for taking the time. I know this is your first podcast as well. So are you emotionally scarred, or how did you find it?
It's my first video podcast as well. So I don't know when the video stops, I think I might have to have a drink.
We'll let everybody know if after we stop recording, Nick cries. Don't worry.
Yeah, I might also do that as well.
Yeah. And I really appreciate, always enjoy listening to you and getting your like practical insights and stuff. And thanks everyone for listening as well. We hope you enjoyed it. Keep an ear open for the next episode. We drop them every Tuesday. And please remember to give us that rating on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening. Thanks very much, everybody. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gerd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.